Okay, hello again. This time, a little bit of a quicker turnaround, thankfully. Let's talk about how one spell changed World of Warcraft's design forever. If you previously played the Burning Crusade, you remember this. Your mana bar was always empty, warlocks were always mana starved. Except, wait a second, you actually don't remember that. Oh, that's right. It's because you had a Shadow Priest in your raid. In vanilla, Shadow Priest was a meme raid spec, of course. In TBC, they became absolutely mandatory. In this video, I want to discuss how Shadow Priest not only became viable in the Burning Crusade, but specifically how one new Shadow Priest spell in TBC fundamentally changed how WoW raids were built forever. If you played a Shadow Priest in vanilla, you already know the deal. You were great at leveling, an absolute beast in PvP, and completely unwanted in raids, of course. Now, yes, some raids did run one single Shadow Priest to boost Warlock's damage in vanilla. You had the Shadow Weaving talent. It would increase all Warlock's DPS in the raid. Of course, with the debuff cap in 2019 vanilla, Shadow Priests were not viable at all. Without the debuff cap in 2024 vanilla, sure, a Shadow Priest could be brought. But let's be real, any semi-hardcore plus guild would not bring a Shadow Priest. Another warrior is always the correct answer in classic vanilla. Shadow Priests in vanilla had poor scaling, not a ton of real utility, and were really just better as healers, respec or sit, right? That's the life of a Shadow Priest in classic vanilla. And really, vanilla equaled raid spots that either just do damage or heal, not about helping other people do damage. And then TBC came, and the one spell that changed raiding forever was introduced, Vampiric Touch. Now, Vampiric Touch, it gave every member in the party 5% mana regen of the shadow damage caused by the priest. This means the more damage the Shadow Priest did, the more mana was returned back to the party. The longer the fight, the more of an impact that Shadow Priest had, keeping his party members' mana bars full, typically warlocks, of course. And suddenly, playing Shadow Priest was not about topping meters. It was about keeping everyone else actually playing the game. Pre-nerf TBC raids consisted of long boss fights where mana was a real limitation, and encounters became endurance tests, unlike vanilla, of course, where fights were quick tank and spank face roll encounters for the most part. In a lot of TBC, running out of mana was the actual DPS check, in a sense. And so you'll ask, why not just bring a raid full of Shadow Priests? Well, it didn't exactly work that way. The weird thing is, raids didn't want multiple Shadow Priests in TBC. You want one and one only. Now, the reason for that is the mana return from Vampiric Touch only affects the party. So in a raid, you have 25 members, and that 25 members is split up into 5 parties of 5. And with Vampiric Touch only affecting the party, so the 4 others that are in the party with the Shadow Priest, a typical group would consist of 1 Shadow Priest, 3 Warlocks, and a Resto Shaman. You always have to have Resto Shamans in TBC, or that's another conversation. But try and add more Shadow Priests than 1, and you hit diminishing returns very fast. That second raid spot is much better spent on a higher DPS output class, like a Mage or another Warlock or something. TBC also forced a better balance of range and melee than vanilla, so in a raid you'll always have like 3 Warlocks, for example. Also, Warlocks are the best DPS in TBC, and you're going to need a Shadow Priest for your Warlocks. It's the only way they would ever be competitive in terms of on logs or anything like that. And so just like that, with the implementation of Vampiric Touch, WoW had a real required support DPS spec for the first time. Vanilla, of course, we had some optional ones, but were never required. In TBC, Shadow Priests are required. You are required to have 1 Shadow Priest in your raid. And this is not a healer, it's not a buffer, it's a DPS whose pure job, the reason a Shadow Priest is there, is to make other DPS possible. Specifically Warlocks, of course. And now here's this part that I think gets very interesting. I think Vampiric Touch itself didn't just make Shadow Priest viable. It forced Blizzard to actually rethink how raids functioned in general. Let me explain. Mana became a group resource, not a personal one. Before TBC, back in classic vanilla, mana was a personal problem. Take healers out of the example. Just think DPS. Healers, of course, always have a shared mana responsibility. But just in terms of DPS, you go as a warlock, that's your fault, right? Your problem. You go as a mage, your problem. Mages are handling their own mana. Vampiric Touch changed that. Now one player's damage directly affected other players' DPS uptime. For the first time in WoW, Blizzard's actually directly tying raid performance to one spec's utility. Vampiric Touch was the first time WoW had a true raid buff tied to DPS. Not a flat aura, not a shout, a blessing, a raid buff earned through gameplay. However, with this, there is a problem. When one spec becomes mandatory, like a Shadow Priest in TBC, balance starts to get weird, and you also start to run into other issues. If you played TBC before, you have likely heard of the roster boss. Now, the roster boss in TBC was known as the most difficult boss in TBC, even tougher than Illidan or Kil'jaeden. This was the problem, the roster boss, of having the right classes online every single raid night. If your single Shadow Priest had to miss raid that night, your overall raid DPS was significantly lower. Significantly. It really impacted the entire raid's DPS. And so this started to cause some issues. And Blizzard recognized it. And after TBC, Blizzard quickly started to move away from mandatory specs and implement major design changes that would stick with WoW forever. Quickly, in Wrath of the Lich King, raid-wide buffs began to replace the party buffs. Remember, Vampiric Touch, Shadow Priest, it's only affecting the immediate party. And Blizzard started to move away from that and say, we're going to go to raid-wide buffs. They added what is called replenishment in Wrath of the Lich King, a crucial raid-wide buff that would restore 1% mana every 5 seconds. And here's the main part. It's not that it was just raid-wide. The kicker is that it wasn't just Shadow Priests that could provide this. Of course, they still could with Vampiric Touch. That would allow replenishment to happen with Vampiric Touch on the raid. But now other classes could. Survival Hunters, Ret Paladins, Mages, Warlocks all could provide replenishment through various talents or abilities. And so began the process. So began the real process that Blizzard and WoW has seen over the years and years and years. It's the process of this homogenization of classes. Now here I'm showing an article from 2009 discussing kind of Blizzard's motto for raiding in Wrath of the Lich King and Cataclysm, kind of in both expansions here as we move forward after TBC previously. And that was the bring the player, not the class. And it was clear from Ghostcrawler at the time, one of the lead designers of the game at the time, it was to steer away from that strict raid composition that a Shadow Priest in TBC created and shake things up, right? Encounters are no longer being designed so that one single class is necessary, and they want to basically have multiple classes that can provide the necessary buffs rather than just one. And this is an example here of kind of the philosophy that started to shift after TBC and after Vampiric Touch and Shadow Priest, specifically in TBC raiding. You know, Blizzard started to move away and really explicitly state this. We are going to bring the player, not the class. And this philosophy is stuck with WoW since. I mean, multiple classes being able to bring the same buffs, general buff homogenization, and overall, a lot of classes just starting to feel the same. in retail, and kind of as it's kind of just progressed through the expansions. Now, Modern WoW, I would say it doesn't really trust any one spec with the keys to the raid, right? And everything important has a backup. Of course, there is still examples of some classes being better than others and certain comps being the best. And once you get to a very high level of rating, world first type stuff, they're bringing specific classes for specific things. But in general, for the general player base, I think Blizzard's philosophy here has really moved to bring the player, not the class. And I've even seen conversations about that at the top level, that of course they want to bring the player is the number one, and then the class is secondary. So Vampiric Touch really, it changed Blizzard's raid philosophy and class design philosophy overall. It taught them a lesson that I think they would never forget. Utility is powerful, but when it's mandatory, it starts to control everything in a raid. So instead of removing utility, Blizzard's solution to this has been to spread it out. And to maybe some people's like or dislike, they continue to do so over and over and over again until really no one spec could define a raid again. And maybe even too far to where not one spec was ever really feeling super unique again. And this, my friends, this is how the Shadow Priest, and specifically Vampiric Touch, changed WoW's design forever. So here's the real question. Was WoW better when one unique class could make or break a raid? Or is it better now that everyone shares that responsibility? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Until next time, friends. See ya.